Welcome to this Recording Data and Rights Implementation Seminar. Here is your agenda. We'll just do a short welcome, and there are one or two logistics we need to bear in mind. I will then provide a short introduction to DDEX in general, looking around the room. Most of you probably know it off by heart by now, but I'm going to do it anyway. And then, which will happen at various times during the day, there'll be an introduction to the standards themselves. And then later on in session 6 and 9, there'll be deeper dives into the standards so that you get the opportunity to understand them in a bit more detail. And then most importantly, actually, for these events, there'll be a number of sessions during the day where members of DDEX will actually explain to you, one, why they wanted to implement these standards, and then B, what sort of issues they had, if any, in trying to do those implementations and what lessons they learned. So that particularly for the large number of people online, hopefully you will find that the most interesting element of today's presentation. There will also be opportunities to ask questions for the members of the audience, both online and physically here, of the members that have done the implementation. So you've got a chance to pick their brains, and we would recommend that you do that as much as you can, because these opportunities don't appear very often. DDEX is a standards organization, and in so being is trying to find ways of efficiently communicating data throughout the music industry value chain. And we do that in a number of ways. The main thing we do is to develop standard formats for you to communicate various data elements to your business partners. I sometimes, in the sort of physical world, compare that to standard forms that you might have to fill out for government or whatever. All of you will fill out the same form, but obviously the data that you put in response to the questions will be different and determined by you personally. And so this is essentially the same. We list all the data elements that need to be communicated to your business partners. It's then up to you to actually put the right data in the right place. And obviously having them standardized, you should, and I stress should, receive the same format from all of your business partners about a specific business transaction, which is obviously more efficient and saves time. As a consequence of standardizing the communication, over the years it has highlighted is that obviously, and this will come as no surprise to most of you, the quality of the metadata, both in terms of creation and maintenance, is not as good as it could be. So inevitably, DDEX does occasionally get into discussions about improving the quality of the metadata, not necessarily because we're looking to standardize anything, but because the community that we represent is very much involved in that kind of activity, either on an individual basis within each company or between a small group of business partners. And so it's important that we liaise with those sorts of activities and those sorts of projects so that those projects conform to DDEX and DDEX conforms to those projects. So it's obviously a two-way transaction. The same thing applies with unique identification. As I'm sure you know, the industry relies very heavily on unique identification. And again, sadly, those systems are not as perfect as we would like them. And again, there are a number of projects, and have been over the years, which have been put in place to try and improve the quality of this unique identification, so that, for example, where there are duplicates, there is a preferred number that gets used across the industry to try and avoid complications and confusions. And so again, we have conversations around those sorts of issues because we do a lot of collaboration with other standards bodies, and in particular IFPI for ISRC and the CSAC for ISWC. Those are obviously the very key standards, unique identification standards for the industry. And so we work very closely with both those organizations to feedback ideas and thoughts from the community that we represent, and also to hear back from them about the projects that they're doing. And yesterday morning at our plenary meeting, we had a lengthy session about a project that is currently going on in relation to ISWCs and getting them allocated much, much earlier in the creation cycle. That's just an example. And then lastly, we collaborate a lot with trade bodies within the industry, of which there are many. The reason being that obviously not all individual companies are in a position to become members of DDEX, but they do need to be aware of what we're doing and why it's important. And so we work closely with all these trade organizations and take opportunities to speak at their events so that we can communicate to their membership a little bit more information than is publicly available on our websites, so they get a better understanding of what we're doing and why. So if I were to try and sum up what we're trying to do, we've got these three areas of standardization: the actual formats, which I've spoke about at length; the choreographies, which is the order in which exchanges of data in message form are actually taking place, what the trigger points are, so that if A sends B a message, then B automatically knows they're expected to do something, whether it's send another message back or do something within their systems. So those choreographies are also standardized. And we actually believe this is an area that's going to drift more into business process over and is beginning to already. And this is not commercial issues at all, but actually the operational processes that parties within the industry go through, which at the moment in a number of instances are very, very complex. There's lots of back and forth and round, and actually standardizing those processes as well as the choreography for the messaging would be very beneficial in terms of cutting out excessive levels of activity across the industry as a whole. And then lastly, of the three, the message protocols, those are the mechanisms by which the messages actually get exchanged, physically get exchanged. Most of that, for most of the time that DDEX has been in existence, has been using secure FTP. There is definitely a drift towards more web services and API technology, which from the Secretariat point of view, we think is absolutely vital for the music industry to move towards. All this batch processing on SFTP sites, given the nature of the industry now and the number of transactions, is just going to bog everybody down. So we've got to start looking at more automated processes, less batch processing in terms of exchanging messages. But that's a subject largely for another day, but it's good to see one or two nodding heads around that particular comment, because that's something we feel from the Secretariat point of view is vital going forward. So these three have all got to work together. And obviously when we standardize them, that's the intention. And that's when you start to really see the efficiencies in the standardization of these three areas. One of the things that really does underpin DDEX is our data dictionary. And it defines all of the terms that we use in all of our messages. And it says lingua franca here, but in some ways I call it a translation mechanism. So if you have company A, which has a data model, A's data model, and company B, who has B's data model, and they're different, the way they can communicate and know from each other what they're talking about is A, translates their data model, their data structures into DDEX, and then B does the same and then ingests the DDEX message, so they then know what A is talking about. So it's effectively been a translation. I always remember quite an old story. Those of you who are of a certain age will remember when Sony and BMG were in a joint venture together. I was told when that first happened and they started looking at the two sets of systems that BMG and Sony had a different definition of the word label, which to me is just mind-boggling that is the case. So, you know, they were really starting at the ground up. If you didn't have a common definition of label, how the hell were two record labels supposed to start working together in terms of the operations? So that's the sort of thing that DDEX is here to try and help. And the data dictionary, as I said, provides all the terms, provides all the semantics relating to those terms, and also what we call common composites. There are obviously a lot of entities in the music industry that get used and need to be communicated about in a whole range of different transactions. Obvious example is a sound recording. And to identify a sound recording, there are a number of data points that you need in order to be able to identify to your business partners a particular sound recording. And so if you look at the DDEX standards, you will find that the way in which the description of a sound recording is done is common throughout, because we use these composites as building blocks for each of the different standards. So even though the standards may be structured slightly differently because they're dealing with a slightly different business transaction, a lot of the building blocks, sound recordings, musical work, parties, so on and so on and so on, will look very much the same. And it very much means when you come to implementation, if you're doing more than one standard, you can very possibly use the code from the first one, at least to partly implement the second one, because a lot of the building blocks are the same. So this is the DDEX famous tube map. Anybody familiar with traveling around in London will recognize it, that it looks like the London tube map. And yes, we did get permission to use it because otherwise we'd have been in real trouble. And what this tries to show is the extensive number of standards that DDEX has that enable different types of business transactions to occur amongst the different type of roles that organizations take within the industry. So, for example, the lines, blue, orange, and dark green lines indicate standards that record companies would use to communicate to their distributor, if they have one, and how the distributor would communicate to a DSP, to a music service. And you can see that there are others relating to other types of transactions within the industry. Even to the extent that we've created a standard that can be used in the studio to collect data at the point of creation. And there's a lot of work going on in that area across the industry at the moment to try and automate that process a great deal more, because at the moment, labels and other interested parties will often receive creator information on Excel spreadsheets, on the back of a fag packet, on a napkin, whatever it happens to be, email, and finding ways of automating that process using the RIN standard is something that you know, is one of those long-term objectives that DDEX has in mind. And obviously for today's purposes, the line that we're interested in is the pinky line that goes straight up from record company to music licensing company. And that is the area that we will be talking about today. So just finally, a few sort of logistical things. DDEX is an open, not-for-profit organization. And we've been in existence now for 18 years, believe it or not. We currently have a membership of about 150, just over 150. When we started, most of the membership came from the first three categories. So owners and administrators of musical work, such as music publishers and musical work collective rights organizations. Record company, or rather owners of rights in recordings, so obviously record companies. We put distributors in that category as well, although they don't necessarily own the rights. They fulfill many of the functions of a record company. And like on the musical work side, the collective rights organizations for sound recordings and performers. And then lastly, we have the digital music retailers, which have really been joined over the years by an increasing number of technology service providers. These are companies that provide high-end sort of fintech type solutions, technical solutions to rights owners and to DSPs. More recently, we've added to that list in terms of we now have a number of music recognition technology companies, because that is now an area that we're looking at. And finally, as I kind of mentioned earlier on, the companies that offer software to creator software for catching data at the point of creation in the studio. However, you do not have to be a member of DDEX to implement the standards. So although we only have 150 members, we've issued about 13,000 implementation licenses. So DDEX goes far and wide in terms of actual usage beyond its membership. And here's just a list of the current charter members. We have a board, obviously, of 21 companies, and they come from each of the different sectors. And those are names that you will recognize up there. And obviously, they are the bigger companies. Inevitably, that's the case when it comes to an organization like DDEX. I've mentioned already, so I can skip through this fairly quickly. We have this concept of liaison organization, which actually isn't membership, as it says up there. And these are very often trade organizations and other standards bodies. And they're there to act as a mechanism for communicating about what we're doing to their members. Very relevant for today, though, is we work closely with other technical solutions that are offering services to the industry as a whole. And I won't go into RDX, SoundSys and VRDB, because somebody else will do that later. But those are examples of technical solutions that the industry is using that are very relevant to what we do and vice versa. And so we work very closely with those organizations to make sure everything is moving in generally the same direction. The resources are really just to show you what, if you want to become a member, the sort of thing that you will have available. We obviously have a general website. We have a knowledge base, which is available to everybody. It provides various different formats of the messages themselves or the standards themselves. But more important, a lot of auxiliary information about how you might go about implementing a particular standard. And there is also a change request form on the website. So if you are a non-member, you are perfectly welcome to suggest changes that might be needed to an existing standard or suggest ideas as to a new standard that we could work on. So we're very open to non-member input and indeed would encourage it as much as possible.